So what I'd like to say is I don't make these review sheets just any old random way. I look at what I'm asking you on the test and then I put it on the sheet. Obviously, these are not the exact words that I'm going to use to ask questions, but these are the things that I'm going to ask you about. So the first thing on this sheet is, can you indicate the pathway of? So I'm asking, do you know where molecules go through your body systems? Specifically, where does food go in your digestive system? Where does blood go through your circulatory system and heart? Where does air go in your respiratory system? And where does urine go in your excretory system? So I'll give you an example. If I was talking about food in my digestive system, I would say that it goes in my mouth, then my esophagus, then my stomach. In other words, all of the organs that are in the GI tract. Now, it doesn't end there. It goes to the intestine, the small intestine, the large intestine. But I'm asking, do you know that food only goes in some of the organs but not in the other ones? For blood through your circulatory system and your heart, we practiced this a number of different ways on a picture with just words. You wrote it on a lab. But this is the idea that it starts with vena cava, right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, all of those pieces of your heart through which blood flows. So same idea there. Could you put them in order? Now keep in mind, this test is not written. It is multiple choice. So you have to be able to select things from a list or to put something in the order that it goes in based on information that is given to you. If we're talking about air through your respiratory system, think about how your mouth or your nose could be the starting point, or it could be both of them. If it's your nose, remember the air is warmer and more humid and cleaner than if it goes in through your mouth. After that, it goes down your trachea, a bronchi, a bronchiole, and then finally the alveoli. Keep in mind that your esophagus and your trachea both run in your neck, and so it's common for me to ask questions that make you recognize whether food or air is supposed to go down one of those tubes. Now for urine in your excretory system, we would focus on a nephron as well as the whole entire system. And I would generally make those two separate questions. If I wanted to ask you specifically about the parts of a nephron, that would be one picture or one diagram. If I was talking about my excretory system as a whole, that would be where I'm talking kidney, ureter, bladder, urethra. Those are the main organs or tubes through which the urine is flowing. If I was going to talk about the nephron specifically, that would be kind of a separate issue. And you'll notice I mentioned nephron later on the sheet. So in this first section, the pathway part, does anyone have anything that they want to ask? Maybe you'd like for me to re-explain something or go over something? This one really isn't an explain it question. This is a remember it question. Do you remember what the parts are and which order they go in? Now the next thing is talking about parts or types. And so you could imagine that these would be good questions to put pictures for. Hey, what's this? Hey, what part is that? If we're talking about a muscle fiber, I would want for you to remember that when I look at a muscle cell and a muscle fiber, there are two myofilaments, actin, and myosin. For carbohydrates, there's mono, di, and polysaccharides, depending on how many units of sugar they're made out of. Can I identify accessory organs? Well, this is where I would look at salivary glands, your pancreas, your liver, your gallbladder. Now I'm just writing words here, but I very realistically could put pictures for some or all of these things. For teeth, think about your canine teeth, your incisors, and your molars. Now technically you have premolars and molars, but because they have the same function, I tend to group them together. Canines are your sharp vampire teeth that you hold food with, and incisors are your front teeth that cut the food. Can I identify enzymes? And I want you to remember there's basically three major categories of enzymes. There's enzymes for fats, enzymes for carbs, and enzymes for proteins. And when we talked about enzymes, I told you to try to categorize them this way. So for example, if I was talking about a carbohydrate, what just happened here? There is amylase in two spots, in your mouth from your salivary glands, and your pancreas also makes amylase. Then you have things like maltase, sucrase, and lactase. So as an example, those are the enzymes that break down carbohydrates. Amylase in your mouth, maltase, sucrase, lactase, and amylase in your small intestine. Now what are the parts of the small intestine? We start with the duodenum, then the jejunum, then the ileum, in order. The duodenum, the first section, is where all of the other accessory organs add their secretions. Your large intestine has the ascending, transverse, and descending sections. The words describe exactly the direction that things are moving through your intestine. In my heart, remember that you have 4 chambers, 4 valves, and 4 major blood vessels. So the 4 chambers are the left and right atria, left and right ventricles. The 4 valves are the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, and then the semilunar valves, pulmonary and aortic. The 4 major vessels are your pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, vena cava, aorta. The last one is the parts or types of lung volumes. And so I'll remind you that we talked about what it would look like on a picture, on a spirograph. We looked at them. There was one in your textbook. We did it on a quest. I would definitely ask you about lung volumes with a picture and ask you what it represented, in a very similar fashion to what I did on the quest. So for example, do you know that this space is your tidal volume, or that this is your expiratory reserve, or that the space underneath here is your residual volume? So do you know from looking at a picture what it's called or what it represents? Now, would anyone like to ask any questions about the parts or types of question there? Yes. Residual or reserve, yep, they're both acceptable. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to ask, maybe a section where you'd like for me to go over things there? The next thing is asking you about functions. So when we talk about proteins, although they do a lot of things, please remember that proteins are what enzymes are made out of. Not all proteins are enzymes, but all enzymes are proteins. That's kind of the way it goes. Now then you'll notice I'm asking you what are the functions of, and then the components of each of your systems. So I gave everybody, for a question like these two, I gave everybody on Friday some unlabeled pictures of all of your systems. If you could look at the picture and tell me what the piece's name is and what the piece's function is, you will be able to answer questions in this area. Now, just so you know, there is no human way I could realistically ask you in 60 questions to name the function of every single part that we have studied. There's no way. I can't ask it. But you need to know the functions that things have, so when I do ask you the function of something, you can answer it correctly. If there's anyone who wasn't here Friday, like you weren't here Friday, there's a copy of that. You weren't here Friday as well. That's for you too. Now the next 2 points are about the functions of the system as a whole. So in your digestive system, there is ingestion, digestion, absorption, and egestion. For your circulatory system, one of the very first things we discussed was how your circulatory system is involved with transport, thermoregulation, and immunity and clotting. So that would be the things that we're talking about for the functions of that. Now, what are the functions of your kidneys? And then I put your excretory system because your kidneys are basically doing all of the work. The other organs are just storing or transporting things. And the main function that your kidneys perform is ridding your body of metabolic waste. But don't forget about pH and osmoregulation, both of which would make an excellent example for the homeostasis question when you're talking about your excretory system. Now, up until that point, because then I'm going to slide the screen down a bit, is there any section in there that someone would like to ask about in more detail, where you'd like some more explanation? Maybe you want me to write a bit more down so that you can see it? So if we keep going, what is the function of hemoglobin? Please make sure that you remember that hemoglobin carries oxygen. Oxygen means cell respiration. That means ATP or energy. And I asked a question like this, both in the section on respiration and in the section on circulation. Please don't forget that hemoglobin also carries CO2. That's not its main function, but it can. And so don't forget that it can also do that. Now, in terms of what your nephrons do, there are 3 major processes that happen inside those tiny little microscopic units in your kidneys. They filter. So remember, not everything can get through the filter. Blood cells are not supposed to get through the filter. They reabsorb molecules that you want, like water. Water is reabsorbed because the concentration outside of the filtrate is higher, and water always follows higher concentration. So if I ask why you're reabsorbing water, it's because you've already reabsorbed other things like sodium and glucose and amino acids. Your nephrons all as well secrete things. That is where substances that your body does not want are added to your urine through active transport. So that would be things like excess hydrogen ions to try to change the pH. That would be things like excess drugs, ammonia, urea, uric acid. Now in the can you explain the difference between section, the first thing are the 3 types of muscles. So I'm going to suggest that you think about their appearance, but also their location, like where they are. Please remember that cardiac muscle is only in your heart, and that striated muscles are, oh gosh, look at how good this drawing is, are only attached to bones. And smooth muscle, generally, you do not control. Smooth muscle is your involuntary type muscle. Now there's more that we could say. Striated muscles and cardiac muscles have stripes on them. Smooth muscle doesn't. We could talk about the fact that striated muscle has lots of nuclei and the other two types do not. But if you think about what they look like or where they are in your body, that should be the clue. Now up to here, because then we're going to have to flip the page over, does anyone have anything that they'd like to ask up till there? So on the other side of the page, we're asking about the difference between actin and myosin. So I'd like to remind you, oh, that was funny. Let's go down. That if I was to draw one sarcomere, that is one unit that contracts in a muscle cell. The sarcomere is made up of two types of myofibrils. You have the skinny actin that's attached to the Z band, so it's attached to the edges. And then in the center, you have the thick myosin strand. And if we were to look closely, myosin has those little heads. They look like little golf clubs or little hooks. And when the muscle contracts, they drag the two sides closer together. ATP is required to let it go. Do I know the difference between carbohydrates, fats, and proteins? I'm going to remind you that proteins have nitrogen in them, while the other two don't. Carbohydrates generally have sort of a hexagon shape about them, whereas fats usually have a backbone with 3 strands on them, a triglyceride fat. Now the next point, coagulation and denaturation, those are both things that happen to proteins. This is when it changes a protein's structure. They both do that. Coagulation is permanent. Denaturation is temporary. So in your digestive system, for example, the pH changes so that sometimes one protein or enzyme will work, and sometimes another protein or enzyme will work. And now for red and white blood cells, here's our focus. Red blood cells carry oxygen. That is their job. And white blood cells play a role in immunity and keeping you healthy. Now the next one goes back to some enzyme stuff. When we're talking about enzymes, molecules could block the function of an enzyme. Competitive means that the active site is actually being blocked, so something else is blocking the active site of the enzyme. Now for physical and chemical digestion, physical digestion is when you break your food, like with your teeth. Chemical digestion is what enzymes do. So when they're actually physically breaking the chemical bonds between molecules, when your teeth, for example, chew your food, or the muscles in your stomach churn your food around, that's mechanical digestion. Endocrine versus exocrine, those are the two ways of describing hormones or enzymes. So in my pancreas, I have 2 hormones, insulin and glucagon. By the by, that would make a great topic for your homeostasis question. But I also have some enzymes. For example, amylase, trypsin, lipase. There's also nuclease. But it's saying that your pancreas does 2 things. It makes hormones, and it also makes enzymes. Now for veins and arteries, remember that veins are thin, they have low pressure, they have valves, and they go towards the heart. Arteries are thick, they have high pressure, They go away from the heart, and they are usually the ones that are carrying oxygen, except for your pulmonary artery. Now for the blood pressure, systolic is the number on top. Diastolic is the number that's on the bottom. Systolic is the pressure when your ventricles contract. Diastolic is the pressure when your ventricles relax. Now, in that section on the second side of the page, is there any part that someone would like to ask about? Maybe you'd like more explanation, you have a question that I have not answered yet. So, the next section is, can you describe the process of? Let's get a new pen color. Sliding filaments is the idea of muscle contraction. Please remember that actin is the one that moves. Myosin stays where it is, and it drags actin across it. Dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis, in particular hydrolysis, that is how enzymes perform their function. Hydrolysis is when water will cut apart a molecule. So you eat a carbohydrate in your digestive system, water will come along with the help of an enzyme and break that molecule apart. Peristalsis are rhythmic muscle contractions. You do not control peristalsis, it just happens. It's stimulated when food enters your digestive system. And that's why, for example, you can eat even when you're upside down. The lock and key model for enzymes is really referring to the active site and how, for an enzyme to work, the substrate has to be the same shape. It has to fit in the active site. And that we lower the activation energy. An enzyme doesn't make a reaction happen, it just makes it happen faster. Now in your small intestine, there are three things that increase surface area. Wrinkles, villi, and microvilli. And that's necessary so that there's lots of exchange between your digestive system and your blood. Now, when we're talking about control of digestive secretions, think about the hormones that play a role. For example, CCK is the hormone that stimulates bile to be produced. Now, your digestive system can also be controlled just by your thoughts. That's how your saliva is produced a lot of the time. But there are a few specific hormones that I could ask about here. Your heart sounds are caused by valves closing in your heart and blood hitting them. Your heartbeat is regulated by the SA node at the top, the AV node in the middle, and the Purkinje fibers that run around both ventricles, kind of in the shape of a V. Now for immunity, there are 5 types of white blood cells. Your B cells, and then for the T cells, there are killer T, helper T, suppressor T, and memory T cells. So maybe just pull one of these desks kind of towards the back and then you can work on it. So you have those 5 types of white blood cells. For blood typing and transfusions, remember the difference between antigens and antibodies. You were interested in what antigens the donor has, so what proteins on their red blood cells they have, and what antibodies the recipient has in their plasma. Deamination, remember, happens in your liver, and that's the process where amino acids are broken down to make urea, uric acid, ammonia, all of the waste products that your kidneys are going to filter out. Now, how is water reabsorbed by your nephron? I'm going to mention ADH, aldosterone, and alcohol, because those are always the things I talk about in the notes. ADH is a hormone. Your brain makes it. Tells your body to reabsorb more water. Aldosterone is a hormone that tells your body to reabsorb sodium, and because water will follow sodium, you reabsorb more water. And alcohol works against that. Alcohol would make you increase your volume of urine. Now, I think I answered the next point by saying that, because we're talking about keeping the level of water the same. In terms of pH balance in your nephron, this is the idea that you can secrete hydrogen ions, so your body will put excess hydrogen into the filtrate so it can become part of your urine. Now, just in this section, can you describe the process of, is there any part so far that someone would like for me to go over more, that you'd like to ask questions about? Is that a question? Nope. So the last few things are asking about inhalation and exhalation. I'll do inhalation, and then I want to remind you that exhalation would be the exact opposite. When you inhale, your muscles contract. This is interesting. Your muscles contract. When your muscles contract, that makes your thoracic volume go up, the pressure in your lungs go down, and air can then come in. In exhalation, it's the opposite. Muscles relax, volume goes down, pressure goes up, air goes out. Now the last section is about describing the effect of, I think I already answered this ADH aldosterone question. When we're talking about muscles, remember that you tear your muscles when you exercise, and so the function of a steroid would be to rebuild them faster and in larger quantity and size. Now in the next one, we're asking about how enzymes function, and I'd really like to focus on pH, because in the digestive system, the pH is not the same in all areas, because some enzymes have a low optimal pH, like pepsin in your stomach. Other enzymes have a high optimal pH, like trypsin in your small intestine. Now CO2 is detected by receptors in your medulla. That is the part of your brain at the base in the brainstem that does a lot of automatic responses, but it will stimulate your diaphragm to contract more so that you breathe faster. Now the last section is just asking about a disorder or a pathology. And you'll notice I didn't put specific conditions here, because usually if I'm going to ask about a disorder, I describe it so that your knowledge is about what the function of a part of your respiratory digestive system is, not the fact that you've memorized this particular disease. So what I'll tell you is there are a couple of questions that involve disorders, but most of them are not based on whether you do or don't know the disorder, but do you know what each part of your respiratory system does? Or do you know what each part of your circulatory system does as its function? Now, is there anything on this bottom part of the sheet that someone would like to ask a question about or talk about further? So here's what I'd like to do then. All right. I'm going to tell you what I would say for the two laws of thermodynamics. So if you couldn't remember what they were, this is what you need to write down so that you know what they are now. I have a couple of pictures to help illustrate what I'm saying they are. In the first law of thermodynamics, I'll just move this up a little bit. In the first law of thermodynamics, I want you to notice how we're trying to show that two things are equal. So I have two types of energy on a scale, and it's exactly horizontal. The first law of thermodynamics says that the energy input has to equal the energy output, whether we're talking about a machine, a living organism, or our entire planet as a whole. The energy that comes in has to equal the energy that goes out. That means that in terms of energy, our planet is an open system. Energy can get in and energy can go out. Now, if we're talking about our planet as a whole, the energy that comes in is solar, and the energy that goes out is heat. And so the idea we're going to try to get across is that the sun is basically the source of all of the energy on our planet. If you remember in Science 10, it's usually a comment that most teachers would make, but not the main focus. The sun is the original source of most of the energy on our planet. There would be a couple of exceptions, but in general, all energy comes from the sun. For example, if I thought about a fossil fuel, like gas, you put that in your car. Is that directly coming from the sun? No, but where did that gas get its energy? Well, probably a dinosaur died if we're in Alberta. How did that dinosaur live? It ate another dinosaur. How did that dinosaur live? It ate a plant. Where did the plant get the energy from? The sun. So the sun, directly or indirectly, is usually the original source of energy for living organisms on our planet. Now, we're not focusing on machines here because this is bio, not physics, but I want you to realize that this is true not just for living organisms, but for other types of devices as well. For example, a windmill. A windmill works because there's wind. Why is there wind? Because the sun's energy is not absorbed in the same amount on every part of our planet, so temperature is different. And the uneven heating is what makes wind happen. So our planet is an open system for energy. The energy that comes in, which is basically solar energy, has to equal the energy that goes out. The first law of thermodynamics specifically says, if we want to be all pro about it, that energy is not created or destroyed, only changed from one form to another. So what we're saying is, I can't make energy from nothing, and I can't get rid of energy. That's why if energy comes in, it has to go out. I can't get rid of it. I can't make it disappear. Something has to happen to it. And so the idea is energy changes form. So in my example, where the sun made a plant do photosynthesis, then a dinosaur ate the plant, then a dinosaur ate the dinosaur, etc., was actually me talking about energy changing form from solar energy to chemical energy to eventually heat energy when I burn the fossil fuel. Now, the second law of thermodynamics is still showing an equality, but the difference is this energy after. It's divided into two chunks. useful energy, and unusable energy. In the second law of thermodynamics, we would say that no conversion is 100% efficient. So if you remember at any point learning about efficiency, this is the topic we're on. Anytime we take energy and convert it from one form to another, we are generally going to get some energy that is usable, that's the kind that we're looking for, and some energy will be wasted almost always as heat. So a lot of energy conversions produce heat as a byproduct, even though heat is not usually what we're looking for. So for example, when you are exercising and your muscles contract, do you need that heat? A lot of the time you don't. A lot of the time it makes you hot and you start sweating to try to reduce the heat that your muscles have created. Now sometimes you want it, don't get me wrong, sometimes you shiver and that heat is necessary because you're trying to increase your body temperature. But a lot of the time we'll say that energy is wasted, not lost, wasted. I can't lose energy. That would mean that I can't find it, it's gone. But it means that when energy converts from one form to another, I'm probably going to get a little bit of heat, sometimes a lot of heat, and that's usually the form of energy that is not the one we are trying to get. So a couple of examples. One I already mentioned, that are biological examples of heat being released would be muscle contraction. Another really good example of something biological where heat is being produced is decomposition. If you have a compost pile in your yard, it's warm near the compost pile compared to the other parts of your yard. Granted, it probably isn't right now because it's winter, but when your compost pile is actively composting, sort of in the summer months, it's a little bit warmer near the compost pile than it would be, let's say, in a part of the yard where there isn't compost. Would anyone like to ask any questions about either of those two definitions or the two examples of heat being released? So I'd just like to say a couple of words about the title then. In Science 10, the last unit is where you would have heard about the biosphere for the first time. It's not our main focus, but I do want you to remember that there are 3 sections in the biosphere. Now, because this is biology, and we are talking about the biosphere, we are focusing on living organisms. So the biosphere is the part of our planet where living organisms are. This overlaps with the atmosphere, which is the air, the lithosphere, which is land, and the hydrosphere, which I like to represent with H2O because then they all start with the same letter. And there's something that I'm going to mention again when we do chapter 2. But I said that the Earth was an open system for energy. But we'll see it's not for matter. My little comment here is that with the exception of meteorites, the matter that is on our planet is the same. It's the same as the matter that was there billions of years ago. I like to tell people that there is a very real possibility that you are breathing the same oxygen molecule that some awesome historic person once breathed. So I like to think of myself as breathing the same oxygen molecules as cool scientist people. That's probably not who you guys are interested in. But so I think about like, hey, Mary Curie might have breathed this air that I'm breathing. Or some really famous king or queen, like maybe Cleopatra breathed this air that I'm breathing right now. It's a real possibility because matter is not leaving our planet. It is staying. The molecules that are here are the same ones that have been there for billions of years. So the Earth is an open system for energy, but it is a closed system for matter. Now, since this chapter's focus is energy, I'm not going to focus on this matter thing anymore right now. We'll do that in chapter 2. But since I mentioned that it's an open system, I like to show you where it's closed as well. Anybody have anything that they'd like to ask at all here? So then I'd like to talk to you about the fate of energy. So we know that the sun's energy is what comes in. We have to know what happens to that energy. So if I take the sun and I use a percentage, it's easier to use a percentage than an actual value because it's really difficult to get an accurate value for how much energy the sun is producing because it varies a lot. So if I just say 100% of the sun's energy, where is it being distributed? Here are the things that I would like for you to notice. Approximately, and this is just approximate, approximately 51% is absorbed by the surface of the earth, by the water in the oceans, by the plants on the land, by something that is on the surface of our planet. That's about half. About half of the sun's energy is absorbed there. That means that if I take all of the rest of this, 49% is not absorbed at the surface. Now in that 49%, about 19% is absorbed by clouds, but the other 30% is reflected immediately. It doesn't even get the chance to be absorbed. Now it can be reflected by the atmosphere, by the surface, by clouds. But if I were to ask you what happens to the sun's energy, I would expect you to know that about half is absorbed at the surface. Of the other half, 19, we could even round it to 20, and I would be okay with that. Percent is absorbed by clouds, so it doesn't actually get to the surface. And the other 30% is reflected. And we're going to focus on the 30% that is reflected. So you'll see underneath here, I wrote that the average albedo is 30%. Albedo is a fancy science way of saying reflected. And I've listed here the things that do the reflecting: clouds, atmosphere, and surface. Now there are a couple of things that will affect albedo, how much of the sun's energy is reflected. If you ask yourself whether I want more or less of it to be reflected, well, ask yourself, if more is reflected, is it actually going to be used for a living organism to live? And the answer would be no, it's not. The more energy that's reflected, the less there is available for use by living organisms. So underneath here, I wrote that different areas of the biosphere receive different amounts of energy due to, we'll put color, texture, latitude, and weather. So I'm going to talk about an example for each of those things. You might know from a previous class or just because you know that if it's hot outside, you probably don't want to be wearing black. Black things will make you feel hotter in the sunshine than something that's white. And so for color, lighter colors increase albedo. And albedo is how much is reflected. So the lighter the color, the more is reflected. Another thing is texture or surface characteristics. Things that are shiny also increase albedo because they will reflect light. Now latitude affects albedo simply because the closer you are to the equator, the more directly the sun is hitting you. Instead of it hitting you kind of at an angle, it's hitting you sort of head on. And so if you have a big latitude, you generally have more albedo. More of the sun's energy is reflected, less of it is absorbed. The last point I put there was weather, and that's because clouds increase albedo. If there's more cloud, then there's less chance that the sun's energy is going to get to the surface of the planet rather than get stuck somewhere in the atmosphere. So just as an example, I'm asking in these two pictures here that represent two very different ecosystems whether the albedo would be high or low. In the top example, the albedo would definitely be high. Here's why. First of all, it's white. Second of all, it's shiny. Third, and I couldn't say this for sure because we didn't give the geographic location, but that does not look like a mountain in some warm continent. That looks like a bunch of snowy mountains that are probably far away from the equator. So I'm going to assume that this is at a pretty big latitude. And lastly, I'm going to think about clouds. When I think about what's the weather like in the Arctic, I don't think about sunshine and rainbows, I think about snowstorms. And so while all of those things might not necessarily be true on a given day, those would be reasons that the albedo would be high. At the very least, snow and ice are white and shiny. And when you have those characteristics, albedo is going to be high. Now down here, albedo should actually be relatively low. First of all, it's a darker color. It's not shiny. Now this forest of trees could be anywhere. It could be close to the equator or far away from the equator. But we would assume that its latitude is less than the incredibly snowy mountains. So that you recall, if we think about ecosystems, there's a line on our planet where trees stop growing. And that's where we start talking about the tundra and the taiga. And you might have heard those words before. But if there's lots of trees, generally the temperature is warmer. The other thing that I would like to mention here is the idea of producers. Trees are going to do photosynthesis. Their job is to absorb sunlight. In an ecosystem where there are a ton of producers around, there are more things to physically absorb the sun's light, which means that there's a greater chance that it will be absorbed instead of reflected. The idea then that you need to understand is if there's different amounts of energy because of albedo, then there are different patterns of life. There are different ecosystems that exist. Now, being able to name all of the ecosystems, like what's the boreal forest, what's the prairie, what's a savanna, that is not our focus, not at all. We're going to talk about ecosystems more generally in terms of where is energy going, how are organisms getting this energy. All I want you to know is that energy affects the life that can exist in an ecosystem. So my two pictures there for albedo illustrate that. More energy means more types of organisms can live there.